Later this week, Donald Trump will make his first visit to Canada as U.S. president when he attends the G7 meeting in Charlevoix, Quebec. This would usually be a meeting of friends, but it comes at a time when relations between Canada and the U.S. are at their worst in decades. Last week, after months of negotiations on NAFTA, the Trump administration imposed heavy tariffs on steel and aluminum from Canada and its other allies. Normally guarded Justin Trudeau responded with language rarely heard from him, invoking the memory of Canada's fallen soldiers on American media just this morning.
The idea that, our soldiers who had fought and died together on the beaches of World War II, and the mountains of Afghanistan, and have stood shoulder to shoulder in some of the most difficult places in the world, that are always there for each other, somehow this is insulting to them.
Listen to that strong shift in tone from the Prime Minister towards Trump. They've maintained at least a cordial demeanor, but these tariffs seem to be the bridge too far. The Canadian government responded with a dollar-for-dollar retaliation with tariffs on U.S. products ranging from steel and aluminum to maple syrup, even gherkins. Speaking with the CBC's Vashi Kapelos, Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland criticized Trump for using national security as a pretext for those tariffs.
I think it is very important for Canada to be very clear that it is particularly absurd, it's even insulting, to take this kind of trade action against Canada on national security grounds. I mean, seriously, Vashi, who thinks that Canada can represent a national security threat to the United States? It's absurd.
Absurd. Canada as a threat to the U.S.? That seemed like an odd choice. Other than, the War of 1812 when we burned down the White House. To make matters worse, the tariffs target America's friends while sparing rivals. The Washington Post reports Trump has officially put more tariffs on U.S. allies than on China, a country with a questionable record on fair trade. Trump will come face-to-face with the leaders of America's allies in Canada this week after imposing bruising tariffs, dialing up the rhetoric, and effectively turning the G7 into a G6+1, hardly the way the U.S. would normally attend a summit among friends. For more on this, I'm joined by former U.S. Trade Representative for George Bush Sr., Ambassador Carla Hills in Washington. Ambassador, thanks very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to join you.
Ambassador, we find ourselves in this moment where America's traditional allies are being attacked on the trade front, and yet its traditional rivals, Russia and China, don't seem to be in the same crosshairs. Does this reflect a shift in terms of strengthening what were once rivals, or at least a shift in the power dynamic?
I hope not. We need to continue to work with those nations that share our values, our democracies, and have been great partners, because the bonds that we have really help us in terms of security. If we have a national emergency like Ebola or some disease, we work together. We're going to lose that if we start having these frictions over that don't work in any event. So we need to work together. We need the brainpower of Canada and Mexico to work with us to get a change here.
Good neighbors have to invest in one another.
You got it.
I look at something, I'm really struck by what President Macron of France said, saying that economic nationalism leads to war. He says this is exactly what happened in the 1930s. When you hear that kind of language coming from a major leader of a G7 country, making that comparison between these two times, what are you left thinking?
Well, I think that you have to pay attention. I wouldn't use the word war because I would hope we'd be wise enough to avoid the problems that we encountered in the 1930s. But I think a trade war is something that we have to be quite concerned about. Retaliation has occurred. If counter-retaliation, then we get into a back and forth on imposing tariffs. It's hard to have a good collegial relationship to deal with security problems, national issues that cross borders, if our economics are at odds. And so I hope we can get this worked out quickly.
Certainly they'll be talking about that at the G7 this week, but I want to look at this call between Prime Minister Trudeau and the U.S. Vice President Mike Pence. Trudeau said he was willing to come down to Washington and get down to the nitty-gritty, the final stages, but Pence responded and said, only if Canada agrees to a sunset clause on NAFTA. And Trudeau said, no way. Do you think that was the right call?
The sunset clause makes no sense to any of the three governments and their economies because it creates uncertainty. You know, the Federal Reserve has a beige book where it lists the problems to the economy, and uncertainty is at the top of the list. So we get a lot of investment in the United States from Canada, and we get a lot of investment from Mexico. And the fact is that if they don't know what the rules are and we're going to pull out in 5 years, you're going to find investment decreasing.
Ambassador Carla Hills, thanks very much for your time today.
Thank you.